We welcome our speakers tonight, Mark Stento and Janice Halaka, and they are in critical roles in terms of enforcing the code in Coconino County and the city of Flagstaff. Mark has been involved in this, I think, for a number of years, previously with the city of Flagstaff. And I guess the county made him an offer he couldn't refuse, so he jumped and went over there too. So, Mark, you are, I think, the Chief Code Compliance Officer for the Coconino County.
That's correct. I run the county's code enforcement.
Okay. And Janice, I think you were there, although I guess it looks like your camera and your microphone is off. Can you hear us?
Sure can.
Yes, you are. Hi. Welcome. So we were just introducing everyone. I hope you heard that too, but you are the Chief Outdoor Lighting Code Enforcement Officer for the city of Flagstaff, which is a really crucial role between the two of you.
Right. Yeah, my position is joint between both Coconino County and City of Flagstaff. So the dark sky compliance specialist for both.
For both. Okay. Anyway, we don't need to get into details of that. I'm sure you have it figured out, and we know who to go to when we got a complaint. We are very interested to learn about the new outdoor lighting code that was adopted last November in the city and the county. I guess it's officially adopted in the county now also. Is that correct, Mark?
That is incorrect. It is currently under review in planning and zoning in the county, and it'll have to go in front of the Board of Supervisors first. I can go into that at length, but let's, what I can do is when we start to look at the general code that the city's adopted and how the county's going to adopt it, which is pretty much verbatim, I can kind of dive into that. So whenever you want us to get started, I'm just trying to get my...
Okay, we'll bear that in mind, but we will expect that sometime in the reasonable future that this will become the law of the land in both the city and the county, and so we can go forward on that basis. But so this code is a major step, and in my opinion, this is probably the best outdoor lighting code that exists in the United States, or even in the world. I know I'll go on that statement, but knowing the history of this and how far it has come, so what I hope that we can learn tonight is more about what this code actually does, what's the differences and the updates that have been added to this, and what that Janice and Mark will be charged with doing in their enforcement activities over in upcoming years. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and who would like to start first? Janice?
I'll go ahead and start us out. Janice has been kind enough to prepare a little presentation. So this is a relatively small group this evening. So I want to kind of structure this as a little more question and answer too. So maybe we can get into your questions a little sooner with such a small group. So to clarify and set expectations appropriately first, I'm code enforcement, right? And Janice is charged with the enforcement and outreach as well. And I was involved in the development of this code from a pragmatic perspective, right? So our enforcement experience has certainly influenced it. But we are not planners. We do not write code for a living. So while I was involved, and I certainly understand the intent of it, and certainly Janice does too, I want to make sure we set a correct perspective on where we're coming from. It's the application and what things actually look like in the field. So keep that perspective in mind as we look at the code. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we can bring that presentation up that Janice has prepared for us, and she'll take over and chat a little bit about what's going on in the city. We're also prepared to tell you, kind of give you an update on how the enforcement outlook looks, right? Because you can have the greatest code in the world, but it doesn't really matter if you can't effectively implement. The boundaries to implementation are substantial, certainly with any progressive code like this, especially when you have a substantial amount of existing non-conforming and illegal properties in both jurisdictions. There are other enforcement difficulties in both jurisdictions, excuse me, and we can certainly touch on those if anyone has questions on them. We can kind of take that on a case-by-case basis. So Janice has been kind enough to prepare this in a sort of a report format. So that's how we'll kind of proceed. If anyone wants to raise their hand in the middle of it and ask questions in the moment or just politely interrupt, please feel free to do so. As we kind of wade through it, I know it can be challenged to kind of go back and try and remember what those questions were. So let me see, I'm kind of used to Teams here. Let me see if I can share my screen. Here it is. Okay. Okay. Before we get into the code, I'm going to follow the structure of how this was prepared. So I'm going to touch a little bit on some other tools that we're using. So is everyone aware of the joint land use study, the recommendations of which resulted in the creation of the position Janice occupies now? It's responsible for lighting in both jurisdictions. Generally speaking, Don, can you speak for the group and say that everyone's aware of that or not? Okay. I'll just go ahead and move on and assume we're not aware of it. So if for anyone who isn't aware, the joint land use studies recommendations from 2016 resulted in the creation of Janice's position. And one of the things that came out of that was the application for a grant by Coconino County supporting the development of some of the tools that were recommended in that grant. One of those tools was the development of a non-compliant lighting database, essentially a non-conforming database of the lighting primarily in the city, some of which was in the county, but we're looking at commercial properties here primarily. As part of the implementation of that component of the grant, there were numerous other things in the grant that I'm not going to go touch on. It was rather extensive. But the big thing for us is the non-compliant lighting database. Chris was involved in that, and Dark Sky Partners contracted with Matrix, who was the who was the one fulfilling the grant to catalog those properties, again primarily in the city. So this was a focal point of that, and as part of the process, we identified well over 200 large commercial parcels, large to medium commercial parcels that that had existing non-compliant lighting and that were critical to monitor moving forward. So Chris's Dark Sky Partners, over the course of a year, and then some actually, they were able to use temporary staff essentially to go into the field to each of those properties and document literally each fixture, take photos, give us locations. And then as, again, part of the fulfillment of the grant, Matrix worked with county GIS. It's housed in our servers, and that's a critical point here. Worked with county GIS to develop essentially a database attached to our existing GIS database, or an app, I should say more accurately, that allowed graphical representation of all that data. The scope of the project was fairly extensive. We identified a couple of points as part of that database. Let me see if I can get it up, and maybe I can share my screen here while I'm also talking. That would be so everyone can kind of get an idea visually of what that might look like. So it's a nifty little database that lets us navigate around graphically and look at lighting essentially. So we have begun to implement use of that database over the last couple of months. Janice has started to learn to use the app that was developed in conjunction with that, and is actively reviewing some of those sites and checking for compliance. So the objective there on some of those was the city primarily could catch lighting as it was being changed before it occurred to essentially get people started on the right path before a major commercial project was undertaken that resulted in essentially a code violation in the city. Certainly it applies to the county too, but there's a serious limit on commercial properties in the county, of course, at least comparatively speaking. While Janice is talking, coming up here, I'm going to try and pull that up so we can see it, and I'm just going to move on from it now. So implementation is something we're actively working on that end. We've met with County GIS to refine the app further. So getting into the changes to the city code, it went into effect on their end on December 15, 2022. Janice has highlighted a couple of the modifications. I'm going to close this slide in a minute and bring it up, and then we can kind of chat about it. I'll highlight some of the significant changes from my end, from the enforcement end. And of course, this applies probably more so to Janice. And then I'll talk about the current county code, which we're dealing with now, how this relates to it versus the city code that it replaced. So as Janice highlighted here, lighting zone 3 was removed, which is a very big deal. Lighting zone 3, if I'm sure most of you are familiar with how the lighting zones were mapped, but lighting zone 1 was, I believe, 2.5 miles outside of the 4 major observatories in the region. Of course, the biggest one affecting the city was NOFS. Lighting zone 2 was several miles outside of that. I want to say 5, but that's honestly something of a guess. It's somewhere around there. And then the rest of the county was zone 3. I'm going to put that into context with lumen calculations so you can see what that means and kind of highlight some of those, the importance of those changes here in a moment. But just know that the 3rd lighting zone, the most prolific lighting zone, is gone, and everything is being rolled into a more restrictive zone countywide, unless there's unless it's in an incorporated area or an area where we otherwise, for some reason, don't have jurisdiction. So the city code was updated, although it already accommodated some LED language in there. Essentially, it's been updated to accommodate modern LED developments. The spectral requirements for narrowband amber LEDs has been updated. I'll touch on that again here shortly too, as quickly as I can. Lumens have been adjusted. So previously the lumen calculations, and if Chris were here, he would probably be cringing a little bit because he's been, obviously a component of this for decades. And his technical knowledge is second to none regarding exterior illumination. And my rudimentary explanations of this are exactly that. So keep that in mind. But the previous version of the code, the city code, had lumen calculations based on legacy exterior lighting sources, high pressure sodium, fluorescence, mercury vapor, etc. And it essentially allowed for more lumens in anticipation that those light sources would have a decrease in lumens as the natural decay of the chemicals in the light itself occurred, and overall illumination was reduced. Certainly LEDs die a little bit over time as well because the drivers start to fail, etc. But the change isn't as dramatic, and there was a modifier included in the previous version of city code that basically required you to multiply your available lumens, divide your available lumens rather by 1.43 if you were using LEDs, which made the permitting process a pain in the butt. It was also confusing for contractors. That's been eliminated, and the overall LED or the overall lumen values, I should say, have been modified. And as I noted, again, the definition for narrow spectrum amber LED has been modified as well to accommodate a more strict range under most circumstances. So I'm going to move that out of the way. You probably don't want to see my email. Maybe you do. I don't know. Let's see. And we're going to pull up. So actually, I have the county's draft up which is a mirror image essentially with some language changed of the city's code. So because that's what I have up and accessible, let me see here. Is that sharing successfully?
Yes.
Outstanding. So understand that this is the county's draft. This is what we've been working on our end, but again, the content is effectively the same. There's going to be some additional items. On the city side, the code references are specific to the city. This is actually a strikeout version. So you can see some specific things that we've struck out in here. But I'm just going to use it because I have it up to highlight a couple major things. The major addition and minor addition modifications language hasn't really been changed. This is kind of an inroad for enforcement to require compliance with current code. If there's a major significant change entailing more than 25% of the additional dwelling units, gross floor area, et cetera, stuff like that on a parcel, we can get our foot in the door and say, you can't do that unless you bring your lighting up to standard. That's a big deal for existing non-conforming properties. The city uses that a lot. As I noted, the boundaries have changed. In all lighting zones, we see some changes to lighting classes. We'll see more use of the lighting classes for reasons I'm not going to go into. There was a conflict in a previous version of code, city code rather, that where lumen calcs conflicted with the lighting classes, and it largely nullified the effectiveness of the lighting classes in defining what types of lighting would be allowed where. In the newer version of the city's code and what will be the county's code, we'll see more effective use of that, where essentially all class 2 safety and security lighting will have to be a narrow band amber, and it will have to conform in most cases to the 589 to 595 nanometer peak wavelength restriction. I think we've eliminated the 15 nanometer. No, we haven't. I think we kept the 15 nanometer with the 50% relative radiant power. But point being, narrowband amber LEDs have to be used for all general safety and security lighting under the previous interpretation of, or under the interpretation for the city's version of previous version of the code. Some class 2 illumination could be non-amber light. That would affect other illumination on the property, and that comes back to those illumination tables that were conflicting with this, that again, I'm not going to go into. Regardless, we're going to see net effect, generally more, or all class 2 lighting, but more as a result being narrowband amber, all general safety and security lighting. Another major addition that will actually make a noticeable difference is the requirement of a 2700 Kelvin limit for recognized class 1 lighting. Class 1s, the general exceptions, right? So the outdoor sales areas over at the auto park, over by the mall, it's exterior eating areas, any place where an applicant can justify pursuant to the definitions in the respective code.
Hey, Mark, 1 second. Are you able to zoom in on your document right here?
Sure. What's up?
There you go. We just had a request on the chat.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Janice. I appreciate it. Is that better?
Yes, it's larger.
Outstanding. The city's code is available online. You can pull up the city's code anytime and look at it on your own. I'm kind of getting into the weeds more than I'm into here, so I'm going to start moving a little faster. We're going to be here all evening, and I don't want to do that to all of us. So, class 3 lighting is decorative lighting. That hasn't really changed. There are significant limits on it. Moving down, we see the lumen calculation tables here. We can see the max lumens available. We only see 2 lighting zones now. It used to be this was 50,000 lumens with the LED modifier I mentioned before. Now it's 35. So the most generous lighting zone that encompasses the entire county and the city, well, soon to be the county, is a limit of 35 lumens per acre for commercial parcels. That's a substantial decrease. Currently in the county, it's 100,000. And it can all be white light technically in the county under its current code. The vast majority has to be narrow band amber because it's all going to be class 2 safety and security light. So the county is going to see a major change in this. The county's code is about 20 years outdated. So we're still working off of a version of the city code that probably would have been around, I think it would have been around the 2001 version, which has been hard. Lighting zone 1 is restricted even further. Those are limited areas, primarily on the far west side of the city, and some within the county as well, over on Dark Sky Drive, I think it is. You guys, I'm sure, know where it is out there. So that area is even more restrictive. We see in single family now, we have nothing's allowed except partially shielded fixtures in zone 2, nothing in zone 1. Currently, I would argue an unreasonable, but a substantial amount of unshielded light in the county is permitted under the county's current antiquated code. In zones 2 and 3, up to 8,000 lumens is permitted in a motion sensitive light that's defined as only on for a short period of time. It's a lot of light, unshielded potential. That's all going away in the county. So on the county side, on the residential side, big changes coming, which is going to be interesting for us to enforce.
So Mark, one question.
Mm-hmm.
This will all be grandfathered, will they not, if it was legal before you adopt the current code? So even though it was legal under the old 2000 code or whatever the previous one was, that will continue until they make some changes.
To an extent, and I'll get into that in just a minute. I'll address that fully here. So shielding requirements for general lighting classes, I'm going to start breezing through this pretty quickly. You can look at the current version of the code. I've hit the most major changes that we're going to see here. Generally, when you're looking at this from an outside perspective, you can look at it as a substantial increase in restriction in the city, and I think substantial in the county would probably be an inadequate way to put it. It was beyond that in the county because ours is so outdated. However, we do not have as many commercial properties, so the impact may not be as much as the city. There have been a few other, actually many other areas of the code that have been cleaned up. Some special uses have been clarified, some more stringent requirements added. There's an ongoing conversation around some time limits for lighting classes that are slated for review at future code revisions. But as we continue to go through it, generally speaking, we have a substantially more restrictive code in all jurisdictions. So does anyone have, before I move on, have any code specific questions now about this stuff? And then before I hand it over to Janice, I will answer your questions about existing non-conforming properties and the enforcement issues associated with it.
I had a question. You just scrolled past a section on street lighting that was crossed out. Does that mean that street lighting is moved in with other things, or?
And remember, this is the county's draft,
right?
So the county doesn't really have street lighting that we handle, right? Go ahead.
So if a developer built in a unincorporated area, is their street lighting covered then?
That's going to likely be regulated under their design review overlay or elsewhere in the review process. So if there's a subdevelopment that has private streets, we're already doing that, right? So the DRO, and then once a master plan is approved, and the DRO is approved as a part of it, lighting is usually a component of that. So we see that out at Shadow Mountain out in Belmont now. Their lighting, they've got some problems, which we're working on, but generally speaking, their lighting is required to be narrowband amber. Same with Village Camp that's out there being developed in the area right now, those tiny homes and everything. Those were conditioned outside of the county's existing lighting ordinance because that's how it's been done in the county. That's how it's kind of set up. So we removed those components and references to street lighting from the city's version to fit the county structure. And we'll continue to require narrowband amber. Our planners were real good about that the last couple of years. When they started to understand the issues out there, like Village Camp, they required all narrowband amber for everything, including class 1 lighting. And they have an outdoor eating area there. I actually had to step back and say, okay, we're going to give you some white light over because we don't want you to have a dinner, away under 589 nanometer, lighting out there, look look pretty bad. So the county has been very restrictive where it can be, because it's aware of its antiquated code. So that's an outstanding question. There are some other areas in here that are blacked out crossed out rather for similar reasons. We don't have an airport, at least one that we control. And we have other components of our code like sign standards that that shouldn't be referenced in this. So again, what you were looking at was the county's version, but the substantive shielding lumen changes are the same.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Anyone else? Oh, you're making it easy on me.
I guess I have a question about house lighting. They're going to be reducing the lumens. I mean, right now there's a lot of houses in my neighborhood that have upward pointing lantern lights, and they put really bright light bulbs in there.
Yep.
So does that mean that they'll have to put less bright light bulbs in?
No, it's probably, so this is a complicated question, and that's a good one because it's going to lead me right into the question about existing non-conforming lighting. So this gets into our territory, and specifically Janice's. Enforcing residential is a challenge, especially in Coconino County, where some unshielded illumination, actually a pretty substantial amount, is permitted under the current antiquated code. What that means is, in the example you gave, there's a good chance that lighting's already illegal. There's a chance it isn't. What the reality is it's going to be very difficult for us because we have to make a case. So in code enforcement, if we want to really push on something, we have to investigate, put a case together, take it in front of a hearing officer, just like we would a judge, and say, here's why we think, there's unlawful land use occurring at this location. In some of the circumstances you described, we can't do that. A best practice in those situations is, talk to the neighbor, have us talk to the neighbor, put them in touch with resources, let them know that generally speaking, you cannot have upward firing light in Coconino County. If that doesn't work, we can, Janice has a spectrometer. She can, and we can tell by looking, but we can tell if something's an LED. As a general rule in the city, if something is an LED, and it was unshielded, it's probably unlawful. The county code or the city code was updated with enough frequency that it kept up with changes in lighting technology. And when LEDs started to come around, the code was updated. If we know LEDs really started seeing prolific use around 2008, 2009 or so for those kind of purposes, more so a little bit later. And if we see an LED in those situations, we know it came after that time frame or during that time frame. And then we can look at the city, or Janice can look at the city's code and say, well, I know this is what applies. Well, in the county, I've had the same dang code for 20 years. So that same code existed before LEDs were around, after LEDs were around. I can't tell if that was put in legally or illegally. So the short version the short answer is we don't know. You could report it to us and we could look at it individually. If anyone were putting new stuff in like that, instantly illegal. They can't do that. But existing, case-by-case situation. Does that answer your question? Or would you like further clarification?
No, I guess that's fine.
Okay. Does anyone else have questions?
I was just wondering about different companies that sell lighting, like Home Depot and places like that. I mean, they have all kinds of outdoor lighting that to me is illegal in the county and the town. Mm-hmm. And people aren't going to know the difference. I mean,
you're correct. We've approached, when I was with the city, I had approached Home Depot. I had approached other places and let them know outright that they are selling lights that are resulting in unlawful properties, essentially unlawful use in the county, or in the city rather. And they sent it up the corporate ladder, and then they stopped talking to us. We don't have any regulatory authority to force them to stop selling it, right? Unless laws were to get changed, we can't do much about it. Now, we talked to some other vendors like the lighting store on 4th Street. I think it's the lighting store, Kai's Place. And we had worked with that vendor as an example to label products that met the city standards so that people could go in there and get a product with our sticker on it that showed it was compliant with the city's codes. That was our way of addressing that. And that's something I'm sure Janice's position will be looking at moving forward. That's a component of the JLUS grant, or not the grant rather, but the study that that resulted in Janice's position. That's one of the directives associated with it, is that outreach.
Okay.
So generally speaking, bringing existing non-conforming properties into compliance is a challenge. Commercial's easier because we have a component of this ordinance in the county that, again, that allows us to force compliance on exterior lighting if there's a substantive change to dwelling units, gross floor area, seating capacity, parking spaces, or the existing exterior lighting constituting 25% or more of one of those aforementioned items on a property. If you do that, instant loss of existing non-conforming or non-compliant lighting, even if it was legal. But tracking the existing non-conforming, so the existing legal lighting that doesn't meet current code, is what that database I was talking about that we developed in conjunction with Matrix as part of the grant is designed to do. So to Chris's credit, he was involved in that when he was, working with us on some of that stuff. He had the foresight to push for some of that stuff. Same with Fred and the other folks at the observatory.
Mark, I have another question. I guess the only quotes enforcement teeth that you have in those cases is a lawsuit.
No, in the county, it's different. The city has a bit of a quagmire when it comes to enforcement through no fault of Janice or Reggie's, more so the bureaucracy involved over there. It's hard. On my end in the county, we've somewhat streamlined our process for both residential and commercial. There's a notice of violation and it gets sent after a period of time, depending on our ability to serve the respondents. It proceeds to a citation and then goes to hearing. And then we state our case in front of a hearing officer, and we ask for penalties, including remediation of the violations. So in the county, we have a fairly refined process that is applicable to any zoning code violation, including lighting issues. The city has a more complicated landscape, and they try very hard. I know they're actively working on it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Does the county include Williams?
No, Williams is an incorporated area.
So no, nothing here pertains to Williams then.
Correct. Williams, we had met with Williams council years ago, and their mayor at the time, who's gone, and had pushed some data regarding PC amber on them for their streetlights, and had really pushed the city's code at the time. It is my understanding, third hand, so take this with a grain of salt, that was rejected by that council then. That mayor is gone, and I have no idea what their stance is on it at this point.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can find something out.
Sure. Okay. Does anyone have anything else before we move on? So Janice has made a lot of success in the county, or excuse me, in the city, with their compliance efforts. Now they have a lot of cases that are in progress. A lot of these take a lot of time to resolve, years in some cases. Again, the regulatory landscape in the city is a little bit different. And even when you can force a commercial property to change their lights or fine them potentially, they may not they may not have the resources to change out all their lights at once. So there's a lot of compromise involved in the enforcement process. And that's something that can really drag out the process. So Janice has prepared some before and after pictures too. The city's been doing a really good job about staying on top of this stuff. I'm going to pull that presentation back up, and she's going to go over some recent successes and some before and after stuff with you. And then we'll have time for some more questions after that. Hopefully. Janice, are you good to go for me to start that up?
Yes.
You got it.
You just wanted to pull that up. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm not seeing it. Were you going to share it on your screen?
Yes. Can you not see my shared screen?
I'm not able to. Is anyone able to see Mark's screen anymore?
No.
No.
Okay. How about now?
Nope.
Should be sharing. Let's see. Trying that.
There we go. Yep.
Got it? Okay.
Yeah. You want to just do full screen?
Yep. So I'm going to go right there. Is that where you'd like me to start?
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right. You got it.
So these are just 3 examples of some of the larger properties that have come into full compliance with the city. All 3 started out as violations started by the specialist, and each property submitted several outdoor lighting permit applications until they were granted an approved permit. And last year, all 3 properties received passing final inspections. So the first example we have is the High Country Motor Lodge, the former Days Inn, and they had reduced over 50,000 of their white light lumens. Does anyone need a definition of what a white light, lumen would be versus a narrowband amber or low pressure sodium? Anything that isn't narrowband amber or low pressure sodium would be classified as white light. So they had reduced over 50,000 lumens, and they had removed all unshielded fixtures, which was predominantly the main violation on this property. The Walmart Supercenter on Huntington reduced over 500,000 white light lumens, and it's pretty much entirely narrowband amber that's on site currently. We also ran into another issue post-inspection. They had stationed these lot cop security. I'm not sure if any of you had noticed the Supercenter on Huntington, but they had those the security lighting. It was a blue flashing light. We had received several complaints, so we had actually had them take those down as well. And the last example is Sterling Point Apartments. We were actually able to stop them mid-development. They were installing very harsh white pole lights all throughout the property, so we were able to kind of stop them in their tracks. And from what they proposed initially on their application to what got approved, they had reduced close to 1 million lumens of their total count allowed for the property.
So Janice, about what percentage of the total light are these reductions? Any off the top of your head idea?
Janice, do you want me to jump in there on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what's important to know is that in the percentages the city calculates on annual reports, but the percentages aren't really relevant. What's happening is a lot of that light is being converted. So the total lumens may go down, but that light is being converted, like in the case of Walmart, for example, from a 4K or a 5K or even a 3K over to a narrow band amber. So the city's really focused on the amount of lumens that gets switched over to fully shielded narrow band amber versus looking at an overall percentage in reduction, although that is a component. It's not a data set we have here because it's not really indicative of the overall reduction in impact. The changing over to fully shielded lights, narrowband amber, even if on a 1-to-1 lumen basis, would still result in a massive reduction in impact, even though you would be keeping the light in this example at 100% in terms of, again, total output. Does that make sense?
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so we have our before photo here, grabbed by Mark. I'm not sure when, but as you can see, we have lights illuminating directly up. All of the lights in the balconies were not shielded. And the after photos, each fixture is shielded and they're using lower output fixtures. So not sure how well you can see the difference in these photos, but in person, it's a pretty stark difference. Next slide. And then here we have the super center. So like I said, they had all of these white light pole lights that were retrofitted to narrowband amber. Both the pole lights and all of the wall sconces at the super center were retrofitted. And then the next slide. And then here are some photos of the Sterling Point Apartments. The main violation on this property, I would say, were the pole lights, but as well as the carport lights. So all of these carport lighting were unshielded, bright white lights, and now they've been shielded and switched to narrowband amber. Next slide. So some of our current projects, we were talking a little bit about residential properties. Some of the biggest offenders that I've run into with residential complaints are short-term rental owners. So they're managed by property managers, or they're just short-term rentals. So we've been contacted by sustainability to add a dark sky component to their short-term management guide, so we can kind of get ahead of some of these violations. One of the bigger projects that should be finished this summer is Little America. We've had several meetings with their GM and Goodman Electric, who has been hired for the project. And so as of now, they have an approved outdoor lighting permit, and we've been given a thorough timeline of the phases of when the project will be complete. So target date is August 2023. And currently, or recently actually, just last year, all of our building permits began to be linked to outdoor lighting permits. We were running into a lot of issues where new developments were given their C of O while their outdoor lighting was not addressed at all. And so we were kind of doing a lot of back work. An example is Mount Eldon Middle School. We were receiving quite a bit of complaints for NEMS. They were given their C of O, but this was prior to the lighting permits being tied together. And currently, all of their lights were retrofitted, their pole lights, were retrofitted to narrowband amber, and we're still currently working on the spotlights for the sign at NEMS. It's still pointing directly up, so that's still in process. Another example is the new U-Haul storage center in town. So this was an example of the building permits being linked to the OLPs being really helpful. They actually weren't given their C of O, or we were working on granting them a temporary C of O until their lighting was addressed. So that's where, the link became really useful on our end for this program. So that's just some of the projects that are going on currently. But was there any questions on the two previous slides?
So I think that's a major step forward to link the C of O to the outdoor lighting permit. That way you can nip a lot of problems before they get actually installed, and you do
Absolutely.
and that's it too. So kudos.
And it'll save a lot of time and money on their end as well. Sterling Point, they had already purchased all of these fixtures, had sent out all of these letters to their residents, and that's actually how it, got to our attention. Is several residents had emailed us and notified us on what was happening, and the stark difference between what they had and what they were integrating to. So really the OLP being tied helps all parties. It just saves all of the time and energy and money, and we can kind of get ahead of it.
Well, that's now become sort of policy for any new development, that they will be made aware of these regulations or limits.
That's right. All pre-application meetings. I don't attend those, but my information is given, and that if any outdoor or exterior lighting is being added or modified for any future project, that they would need to have an OLP approved in place. And I also provide the final lighting inspection prior to any C of O being granted.
Excellent.
So it's similar in the county now for commercial properties. The struggle is residential. When the new codes come in or comes into effect in the county, we're going to have to link our individual single-family development building inspections to inspections for lighting compliance, and that's going to increase Janice's workload probably substantially. But development's slowing down in the county. But some of those things can be a drive. County's big. So,
well, not just that. I mean, I used to live on the east side, and what I noticed, I lived there for 15 years, and when we first moved out there, it was really very dark. But outdoor lighting, especially, and with new homes that were being built out there, and even new occupants, the number of sort of floodlights pointing in every which direction has increased tremendously, as I'm sure you're aware. How can one address those issues if they're after the fact, or will they be grandfathered in and so forth? That to me would be the most challenging thing that you folks will face, right?
We agree. The data shows that single family is, especially in the county, is extremely high impact. Some areas more than others. We've used drones to identify problem areas in the city specifically, and we know which neighborhoods are particularly problematic. In the county, it's a whole nother animal. Generally speaking, code enforcement in the county is a whole nother animal. I don't have a good answer to that. We have enough of a process when it comes to looking at violations where we can, generally in the city rule out an existing non-conforming lights. Like if someone has an old incandescent light on their porch and it's like a carriage style fixture and they haven't changed it, there's a good chance it's, we can't do anything about it, or Janice can't do anything about it. But if it's an LED in the city, then it's pretty much a given. So it's not legal. In the city, that's an easier thing. In the county, and I touched on that earlier, because of the wide span of time our antiquated code has been in effect, those are dang near impossible to identify. So I don't have a good answer. We've determined that the long-term solution to single-family residential is outreach and making sure products that are dark sky friendly are available in the region, and that there's an enforcement component. So those three things: product availability, code awareness, and enforcement for stubborn folks,
right,
or really bad actors. That's the key, but it's a problem. It's going to take time. Security concerns, especially in the remote parts of the county, are more relevant than ever, I would say, based on my interactions with residents.
That brings to mind a question I have for Janice, and that is, I'm curious as to how cooperative the Walmart Supercenter was. It's got to be frustrating to have to make changes. I understand that, but what was the basic tenor?
Mark, I don't know if you wanted to give some input here. Mark actually started this violation, and I believe it was two contractors. It was Loeb Electric was the company that was hired, and then they had subcontracted it to NJ and Sham. From my experience with Loeb, they were pretty cooperative. NJ and Sham, there were some issues with installation. But yeah, Mark, did you want to share?
Yeah, the commercial properties from an enforcement perspective are not that bad. Walmart, I started that in 2020 when I was still with the city. There's always some initial, what are you talking about kind of stuff. And then right. you can usually find your way around that. They weren't any worse than any others. I guess
the second part of that question is if you do have some good neighbors that have complied, and as you're dealing with new violations, you can point to hopefully people like the Walmart Supercenter and say, here's a good example of somebody, and the photographs were very helpful, of a business that was cooperative, and hey, they are celebrating Flagstaff as the first dark sky city.
Examples are a regular thing. The corporate world doesn't necessarily agree with our lighting standards, so that's where the enforcement side comes in. We pitch that. I'm sure Janice still does. We used to pitch that all the time. It's hit or miss. Just be glad there's a code enforcement section to back this up in the city, is all I'll say.
Another question I had, I lived in California before we moved here, and of course there, lighting is ubiquitous. However, one thing that was enforced in many residential areas is if there is light that, say, from one house to the next, outdoor lighting, floodlights, whatever, that actually impinges on your bedroom or your house or whatever, and you can never have real darkness, then the local city would go by and put a shield on the light, or in fact ask the people to point it down, because now it was a question not of their rights to do whatever they want. No, they were basically annoying the neighbors, or some such argument, and impinging on the neighbors' rights. I know it's very convoluted, but is there anything like that could apply to the county and the violators there that are just pointing floodlights all over the place?
There's light trespass. There's light trespass.
Right, that's the term I was looking for. Right, thanks.
Yeah, I've got some echo there with someone, but there are light trespass components of both codes. The city's is more robust. The county's is not. In actual enforcement scenarios, if it's pretty bad, it's a pretty easy case. If it's, there's a subjective interpretation there with lower level violations, and in some of those cases, it can be a little bit challenging. But it is something both jurisdictions do.
Okay, good, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I have a general question for both of you. So one of the major goals for FDSC now is to help people in other areas who would like to adopt the Flagstaff practices for things. How much of a job do you think it will be for someone to create perhaps a guide to help people who are in both of your positions in another place? The codes pretty much speak for themselves, but they don't carry all of this practical knowledge about implementation and enforcement. And from my perspective, this is something that would be very helpful to be able to give someone else in a different place, because there's going to be people who have jobs like yours, or unfortunately, there's not enough people who have your particular jobs anywhere else, but there will need to be people who do the implementation and enforcement.
So my perspective on that when I was doing lighting all the time, and Janice, feel free to interject here at any time, but was that first you obviously you had to have the code in place, right? You really had to have buy-in from the community. The reality of code enforcement, it varies depending on your jurisdiction. In some states, they're sworn positions. So you have essentially police officers going around doing zoning code enforcement too. In Arizona, the state really restricts our ability to enforce a lot of things. My point is the individual department responsible for enforcement, it may be under varying levels of existing stress that are prohibitive when you add a highly technical component like lighting enforcement to it. So if we come in there and talk to them and say, all right, let's talk about non-conforming lighting or dealing with LEDs, you're going to get kicked out of the room. So a gradual, and this is again highly subjective, but a gradual implementation process focused on community buy-in, code modifications, community outreach, working with commercial properties on impact reduction there, minimizing the enforcement resources necessary to do it, and then gradually implementing that approach you find in some of our jurisdictions might be effective. Otherwise, I don't know. You could have a contractor potentially go out there and try and help them. And I've worked with the city of Page, who's incorporated, obviously. They have a very old or very basic level of lighting code and enforcement. I met with them and their planners who also do enforcement stuff and are spread very thin. I say planners, I think there was one. This job requires working at night. They're already working full days. So as an outside resource, I sat down with them over the course of a day and reviewed all of their exterior lighting. So that approach, I guess you could say contractual approach may be helpful as well. I don't know if any of this answers your question, but it's definitely a small phased in approach for new jurisdictions who are looking at this. It's a can of worms for sure. If you have specific scenarios and, we can help you with that, I'll be happy to sit down. I'm sure Janice would too, be happy to sit down and review a specific scenario so we can provide probably more relevant information.
Well, that's much appreciated. We're just kind of looking at it from the step back and get started point of view. And most of the things you just mentioned are already on our list that, as far as advice, I was up in Fairbanks, Alaska a year ago at their request to talk about these issues, and the community buy-in was the first thing I said. It's like, this isn't going to go anywhere unless your citizens decide it's an important thing, that it's worthwhile, to have the community address. And it's not something that can be done independent of that. That's for sure.
Yeah. It really is true. And starting, well, yeah. If there's something we can help you on or chat with you about, please reach out.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. We'll put our
Thank
contact.
you for sharing your expertise. We appreciate it.
Very much so. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Both of you.
Keep up the good work.
I feel like I'm still learning. I'm going to put my contact info in here. My email address, if you have any questions or concerns that's related to the county, you can send them to me. If it's specific to an enforcement case, then send it to Janice too. Janice, do you want to put your contact info in? Oh, yep, you beat me to it. Thanks. I think we're about out of time. So does anyone have anything final for us before we go?
No, other than thank you and good luck. Keep it up.
We appreciate this very much. And if you see any ways in which the coalition might be able to assist in these efforts, please contact us.
Tell you what, I can tell you one.
Just tromping to go out in the field and slay those light monsters out there.
I can tell you one right now, and that's keep your website updated. We refer people to it all the time because it's one of the few resources like it.
Yep.
And that content is easy for people to digest. It's well done. It doesn't need much in terms of changes. Just keep it up to date. It serves as a resource, as the county doesn't have a web developer who's going to sit down and put together a code enforcement page that shows how what best practices are, what a narrow spectrum amber LED is, et cetera. Janice, I'm sure, talks about it all the time to her contacts. I certainly deal with it too. But having that website available is a huge benefit to both agencies. So you guys keep that up. I'm glad you mentioned it. Thank you for that.
Yeah, well, we certainly intend to do that. So
outstanding.
Once again, thank to the two of you. We learned a lot and look forward to all these great activities in the future. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Yep, you
Thank
too.
you.
Fun.
Bye.